Well, thank you for having me tonight, and it's been a great day. We've got to take a little tour through the gardens, and always fun to come to SFA and see what's on the burner. And so we'll talk a little bit tonight about creating gardens with seed. And although there are alternatives, as you know, to creating gardens, I think that seed has this wonderful potential of, especially for like prairie landscapes, of creating large gardens in a somewhat economical manner. And then by doing these gardens very often, if you're successful, you're creating biodiversity that you generally have to travel to see. And at least from my standpoint from South Louisiana, we don't have prairie remnants like you have in Texas, in a big way like you have in Texas. And very often you'll travel for miles and miles and miles before you see one plant on the side of the road at 55. I was very fortunate to come into contact with some wonderful people who, Dr. Charles Allen, Malcolm Vadrine, and others who have done some work in Louisiana, pioneering work with working with seed of prairies and being a little successful and then working a little more and so forth and so on. And so I think if there's one point that I can make with regard to a prairie landscape, let's say, is that it's really a grass landscape, and it happens to have wildflowers in it. And the idea of having just wildflowers and not a lot of grasses is maybe applicable when you go into Texas and then, let's say, the hill country of Texas, where of course, the bluebonnets are so famous, but in Louisiana, when we have grasslands, if we don't do some kind of management, we have a forest. And typically, not always, but in some prairie conditions like the southwestern part of Louisiana, we have tall grass prairie, as you will probably know, and I'm going to try there. Okay, so just to very briefly cover the ideas in this image, we'll talk about the coastal plain of the Gulf South and the Atlantic coast. And there's an image here that I'll point out right here, the Black Belt Prairie of Alabama, Mississippi, that you see here, and then the Blackland Prairie, which is a mirror, if you will, of these. So these are all Blackland Prairie. In South Louisiana, you've got this tallgrass prairie, Cajun prairie, as it's called. And then some of the other major prairie areas, the Grand Prairie in Arkansas and Barrens in Kentucky, Dry Prairie in Florida. But there are all these little tiny types of prairies, little pockets of prairies like glades in Tennessee. And as you know, going into Texas, lots of different types of prairies and variations of prairies. And then we look at finally the pine area, longleaf pine, and of course that's where we are today. And so we talk about grasses and prairies, and we talk about deep roots, filtrating water, and creating a lot of biodiversity underground. And so much of the prairie that you see is really underground as far as the biomass is concerned. Estimated, 30% of the prairie is above ground and 70% is below ground. So a lot of root mass, a lot of organisms underground. And some of these roots as deep as 10, 12 feet. So they create these channels of roots that go down, and each year a good portion of those roots, at least of the grasses, die off, and new roots emerge or grow in the summer. And so you have these old roots that die off and create biomass and create soil. And sometimes, like in the case of the Midwestern prairies, some of the best soil in the world, and same thing is true down in South Louisiana. And a prairie is not just one type, it's a multitude of types within a single type of prairie. And so, and that changes from month to month. So there's not a lot of everything staying the same in prairies. So it's always developing and changing and creating new landscapes right before your eyes. And these are gardens that you can have, if you create them, that you can more or less do your gardening in your garden and have your prairie kind of take care of itself for the most part. And so there's not a lot of gardening in a prairie. Maybe annual gardening, but not like weekly gardening. At least that's my perspective, and I try to do as least as I have to in a landscape. We talk about blackland prairie, and this is Alabama, and blackland prairie, and then these little pockets in the interior of Louisiana that have these blackland prairie components or elements, and some of the same plants that you would find in some of the blackland prairies. So this is Copenhagen Prairie in Louisiana, a restored prairie in north of Eunice in Durald, Dr. Allen was involved with. Yep. And you can see that there's just a variety of landscapes that are created, that are out there, and can be recreated. This is a pine land forest, landscape, grassland, and so you couldn't really tell that it's, let's say, different than some of the other slides. They're highly variable. But we are talking about grasses and their prominence in the prairies, and the fact that, at least from my perspective, that grasses really need to be part of any kind of seeding that you might do to create a landscape, because they have the ability to push out. They're very aggressive. They produce a lot of seed and a lot, typically, some of these grasses are very viable as far as the seeds are concerned. And so you have these populations that are always proliferating, and you have these flowering species that grow amongst the grasses that are able to sustain, even though the pressure is great, at least many of the species. Even some of the prairie species that are really desirable species aren't able to take a lot of the pressure that some of the grasses put, and so they tend to move out or move out altogether, move to the edges, let's say. This is broom sedge, actually, Virginia Andropogon virginicum. Okay, and then so just a little bit of a idea of how I started with this work is due to Dr. Allen and his work with grasses, and then discovering little tiny remnant prairies in Louisiana, and this is from the 1980s, mid-80s, Malcolm Vadrine photograph, and some of the Cajun prairies down in South Louisiana. And eventually, Dr. Allen organized seed collecting events, and then, as you see here, rescuing plants. And you can see that this has been plowed, and seed and plants were installed, and the landscape began to develop. One thing you get from seed that you might not, if you're collecting seed, one thing you get from that you might not get from, let's say, seed that you buy off the internet is the possibility that you'll get mycorrhizal spores. These are underground fungi that are beneficial to a lot of these prairie species. And the same is the case with rescuing plants that are imminently in danger, and plugging those in, you're inoculating the soil with prairie soil. This is the Eunice Prairie and Dr. Vadrine on the right with a class from LSU. Got grazing possibilities for prairies. And then, as in Austin, this is a field of prairie that's been baled for many generations, at least a few generations or more. And so you can actually go in and harvest the prairie, and it'll actually return. And you maintain and you preserve the land by working with it, and you benefiting from it. And so, a little project that I was able to do in South Louisiana with seed, and then these are some fields that are in Eunice. Vernon Fuselier, who's a neighbor of Dr. Vadrine, actually went and started hand collecting seed and created these big grasslands that he grazes, and he sells his beef as grass-fed beef. So a little bit of seed goes a long way with regard to these gardens. Some of the gardens that I worked with to begin with, I was just out actually, hand collecting seed, put them in paper bags, and storing them until it was time to plant. There's a lot of history with regard to creating a meadow garden or a landscape of wildflowers, and a typical English garden where you can include some ornamental plants as well. And then there's a big, over the last 10, 15 years, Piet Oudolf, who is Dutch, I believe, has worked with using ornamental plants in plantings from actual plants, but using aggressive species to create ornamental gardens that on their own suppress weeds to a certain degree and create a more manageable landscape. So there are lots of different variations or directions you can go with the idea of creating a meadow-like or meadow type of garden. And seed, to me, is the more interesting way. And, obviously, urban applications can be done with this same type of landscape. This is not my work, but it's an example. And, premier gardens like SFA, Denver Botanical Garden, as you see here, with they have two different types of prairie landscapes. And then going to the grass landscape, this is Little Blue Stem, Indian Blue Stem, Storm King Art Sculpture Gardens. And so the idea of the Prairie Society in Louisiana, the Cajun Prairie Society, was to take seed from a high-quality prairie and move it to a new location. And you create a facsimile of that prairie, however it develops, and you preserve the genetics, and you create a bit of awareness by creating the garden from seed. And then so in 1997, I started this project at my place in Mississippi, in South Mississippi, a 10-acre project that I divided into 50 different blocks. and this is it right here. And then again, these were like maybe say 50, these are 50 by 50s, and an acre right here, and so I was actually using handfuls of seed to spread around that area, and all I did was plow the ground. I didn't do anything after that. Didn't know how to do anything after that, other than to get the seed out there and hope for the best. And as time went on, I had my concerns about whether this is working or that is working. Well, a lot of things happened. Out of all those 50 experiments, most of them worked pretty well, and most of them developed, and many of them developed into some really incredible landscapes or gardens. So we're using lots of species, as many as I can focus on, that are, let's say, long-lived species, aggressive species, and species that are, let's say, found in high-quality landscapes, grassland type of landscapes. And so maybe a dozen species in my hand here. And from one little Monarda pod, you can create a really nice garden. This is machine collected, like a flail vac collected seed. And this is from a bog. You can see hatpin seed, and there's some different non-grass species and flowering species. I think that's Rexia right there. So you can see all the leaves and the pods and the different parts of the plants that are gathered. I basically just take that and distribute it across the landscape. And you can do any number of different things before you seed it. You can do not much, but plow it. What I did learn was that that there are some grasses that are desirable as far as ornamental value and as far as their aggressive capability. So that, like little bluestem, split-beard bluestem, and even Virginia bluestem, bushy bluestem, these are all plants that will come up from seed fairly readily. And I tend to use a lot of grasses, and very often, especially in an urban condition or a high-profile condition, I'm trying to use all the grasses that are low in stature and not like 8-foot switch grasses and that sort of thing. Although I have nothing against 8-foot switch grasses. But the point is that there is so much experimentation to be done and so many new things to find and so many different possibilities. If you can imagine, I typically put in a seed mix 100 species, and sometimes maybe as much as 120 or 150 species on occasion. If you can imagine just what you can do with 10 species, the combinations of, a mass of this and a mass of that and so forth. It's just mind-boggling what you can possibly do, and I just wish I was younger to do some more of these things. But I do a lot of experimentation with my seeds, even today. One of the latest things I'm working on, or I'm using, is this, I'm kind of encircling the prairie. So when I'm doing a prairie planting, I'll put more seed on the outside than the seed on the inside of the block. And what that does is it covers the outside edge, and that edge tends to move inwardly. And so there's just so many possibilities, and I encourage everybody to try working with some seed that you have probably in your garden, like some of these prairie plants like Monardas and Rudbeckia maxima. I've seen a lot of that today. Pycnanthemums, eryngiums, Rudbeckia, the grasses and the aster family, I believe it is, are the two largest families of plants in our part of the country. And so, if you sow 15 species of aster 8 or 10 of them are going to come up, and maybe more. And some of these plants are more easily produced in the landscape than others. Some more quickly produced, like for instance, Monarda is one that shows up the first year. Little blue stem shows up the first year. They generally don't start growing until it gets good and hot. Right now, planting in the fall. And so what I would recommend doing if you were going to be doing a planting like this is to do some type of preparation, and repetitive tilling is one way, but if you're on a slope, you can't very well do repetitive tilling to a certain degree. But I'm actually, there are plowers and sprayers, and I do spray herbicide. Having a discussion today about herbicide, and it's, the little bit of herbicide that I might use on an acre, and then never have to use herbicide again, and create a landscape that's extremely diverse and long, lived. And so it's a bit of a trade-off. But then again, if you can possibly plow it, and I've done plowing on slopes as well, you just have to be real careful and not create a problem for yourself. But yes, planting in November is optimum, at least from what Dr. Allen's research tells us, and that you basically just put the seed out. One of the things that I've been doing lately is to press the seed in the ground, and so I'll use a cultipacker, which is basically just a rolling press on the back of a tractor, and it just pushes the seed down. And what that does is it makes good soil seed contact, just like you were planting soybeans. That's the kind of mechanisms they use. They put the seed in the ground, and then they roll over it with a press. And if you press an area and you don't press an area, you'll see the difference. And the reason why you would use a cultipacker, because you'll get much more growth much more quickly because the seed soil contact is there, and things happen.
Plowing, are you talking about deep plowing or light disking or what?
Light disking. I've done tilling with a tractor tiller. I wouldn't know what deep plowing is. I suspect that's really, turning soil way down. And I wouldn't necessarily, a lot of people are anti-tilling but the point is that if you have a piece of land that's had disturbance on it over the years, whether it's been plowed or like in the city urban condition, it's much more difficult to create these landscapes that are planned, that you hope for, because you have so much competition. So much introduced species. And before I go any further, can somebody stop me at 45 minutes from one? Okay. So did I touch on your question? Okay. All right. So to give you an idea of what hand collecting can do, this is about 45 minutes on a roadside. Liatris acidota, and this is a shopping bag with a seed about yay deep, and a handful. You can see how many there might be. I don't know. I'm going to guess 500 seed in my hand right there, and so you can gather a lot of seed, because these plants have a lot of seed in each flower, for the most part. And so a little bit of seed goes a long way. And little handheld machine, that was a grant, and this is a roadside in Alabama with Gaillardia astivalis, like I've never seen it. And just a wonderful experience for me just to be collecting that seed. It's a little hand thresher out of Canada, and and you can gather a pretty good bit of seed with that in no time. And then a flail vac, you can gather quite a bit of seed with that. When I'm collecting by hand, which I still do, I'll actually go in and cut the tops of the plants out and just put them in a tarp. I don't, sometimes I'll pull seed if they're easily pulled from the plant, but most of the time I'll just cut them. It's much easier that way. You put them in a tarp, you bring them home or whatever, and you dry them out like you see here. I'll leave this out each day, roll it up at night. If it's dry, I'll even leave it, at night for a couple of days, 3 days maybe, and it's pretty much dry. And then what happens is when you go to sow this, I store the seed in a dry condition, in basically just air condition. I don't have a fancy cooler. You don't really need one. You can get one, but you don't need it. And then when you go to plant the seed, you just get that seed right there out into the landscape. Now you can create all kinds of gardens in the landscape, and lately I've been doing that. Creating or seeding a whole area with a mix of seed, and then going in and doing a patch of this and a patch of that and a patch of this and a patch of that. So you can create these little garden effects, which will happen even if you don't do that to some degree. But you can at least, the work I'm doing is, it's not like, I have 100 species that are individual. A lot of the species that I'm collecting, there might be 30 species in a collection, and then I'll just add these others to it to create a little bit more biodiversity, etc. So grasses, bushy bluestem, as you see here, is, in a matter of a couple of days you can dry that out, and it's a lot of seed. The way I'm doing gardens, and maybe that's not so much the case in some parts of Texas, even black belt prairies maybe won't burn like you see, landscapes that are really heavy in grasses, they will burn. And then, so a lot of these prairie species, at least pineland species and the tallgrass prairie species, they are what are called pyrogenic, which means that these plants depend on fire to some degree to survive and proliferate, and that some even aren't able to produce seed or to do their thing unless they get that fire. When you get to some of these high echelon species, at least that's my perspective. So using fire is not something that I would recommend to just everybody out there to go burn your yard. However, you can become educated and skilled at it, and I highly recommend that you take advantage of that idea. And whether your prairie's 20 feet by 20 feet or an acre, use good techniques. I think typically what I would recommend is to have somebody come burn it for you on a number of occasions and work with them, and then you'll learn a little bit about your own property and how to manage it, and you'll learn some techniques. And that's generally what you would want to do. You want to become certified, which is making you very dangerous, but you then work under someone else who is skilled, who can teach you actually how to implement what you've learned to be certified.
How does the burning affect the success? Does it prevent clumping?
So the question was, how does the burning affect the landscape? And I would say it acts as a trigger mechanism. And so these plant communities, as you would have around here, were naturally subjected to fire through either lightning or through Native Americans using fire, which they really did on a regular basis. And what that does is as far as my work is concerned in creating landscapes from these seed, the fire actually encourages the prairie species to grow, flower, fruit, etc. And it discourages some of the weedy species, the annual species, the early succession species. Fire moves out early succession species and encourages the late succession species, if that makes any sense. But so what you have with the prairie is not something that is, again, it's not static. Or it's not stable. It doesn't just look like it always does. It always changes. And so right now in the spring, we're just passing the time where Baptisia and some of the early flowering plants, like April, and then we go into May with penstemons. These are all at my place in Mississippi. Baptisia alba, right here, is a wonderful plant to work with. It's super tough plant. And then, I noticed we were talking about, this is Baptisia sphaerocarpa, which is common in the Cajun prairie. And we were seeing lots of Baptisia nuttallii on the roadsides coming in from the east this morning. And then for fun, I introduced Baptisia australis, which is not a native to where we are. And then Baptisia bracteata, and it goes on and on. So you can use lots of different species of these genus. And then what happens is, as in the case of the Eunice prairie, where I have collected seed over time, you end up with these hybrids that when Dr. Allen, Dr. Vadrine, and the other volunteers move these plants from different prairies into one area, they, over the years, crossed and hybridized and created these different plants. And so numerous variations. When you go to Eunice, you can see you can see different parts. For instance, this plant right here has the horizontal branch flowering habit of Baptisia bracteata, but it happens to be a white flowering bracteata hybrid. So it's got Baptisia alba and Baptisia bracteata. This one actually has this real dark stem, purple stems. And this one right here is one from Peter Luce 20 years ago. It's in my field. I put my tractor here because I was telling Peter today that this, where my fingertip is 84 inches tall, okay? So that's 7 feet. And that's how tall that Baptisia is right there. And that's from, where is that, Peter?
West-northwest of here.
Okay. So everything is bigger in Texas. Okay. So all kinds of different plants you can use.
What's that one called?
It's coral bean. Very, very easy to grow. In fact, if you can get some coral bean seeds, and it took me 20 years to learn this, you take the seed and you take a pair of pruners and you snip off the tip of that red seed until you see white in there. And what I've done in the past is just stick it in the ground and just walk away, and you can see them pop up. What you're doing is you're breaking that coat so the water can get inside the seed and embryo, and then it starts to grow. Used to put them in the microwave for about a minute or two, and they'll swell up overnight. But I tell people that when you cut the tip off, I don't know where I learned that. I may have learned it from Peter or somebody. Okay, so if you have 10 seeds and you cut the tips off of those 10 seeds, you'll get 11 to germinate. So wonderful plants in the prairie that are called hyperpollinator species. So a good example is the eryngium. and at least for us, the Yuccifolia, and it is said that there are up to, or maybe more than 200 species are attracted to that plant either for the nectar or as a predator to prey on the nectaring insects. So a lot of activity in a prairie. And in fact, what I've heard, I don't know if it's true, but I heard it from somebody I respect, said that the more grasshoppers you see in a prairie, the healthier the prairie is. You can actually just walk through the prairie and in recreated prairies, and you'll see insects that you would never see otherwise. And so you have to have a lot of species to attract a lot of different insects. A lot of different insects make for a lot of happy birds and happy plants and happy prairie owner. Phlox and variations of phlox, you could even introduce phlox that aren't even native to your garden, that are typically subjected historically to fire, and those will do just fine. And so you can add things like bulbs to your prairie, like rain lilies are a good example, and any number of different bulbs that'll be able to take the fire, that aren't naturally, let's say, in the prairie, but are adaptable to the conditions. Just an example of different silphiums, which is a wonderful plant for bird attraction and great nectar plant, but an absolutely wonderful ornamental plant. Silphium integrifolia, Silphium terebinthinacea, and I thought I would impress you with that one. This is Silphium asteriscus, and so the point is, even without flowers, you've got these ornamental plants. Leaves are just as ornamental. Monarda is one plant that shows up and stays. There's a number of different, ones that I've worked with. Punctata is a great plant. We've got variations of Monardas, but on the left above here, Lindheimeri, and a light variation, coloration, and a darker coloration of Fistulosum. We'll move on. So I mentioned Monardas, Pycnanthemum. This is what you can do with Pycnanthemum tenuifolia. So Pycnanthemum tenuifolia is right here, longhorn beetles on it, and it's super pollinator species plant. And this really doesn't take much seed to do this. It takes about 20 years. It takes a lot of time. But that plant shows up like the first year from seed, and sometimes it doesn't bloom. A lot of these plants don't bloom the first year. Sometimes they don't bloom for a couple of years. Like in the case of Baptisia, sometimes it takes 3 or 4 years before you finally see one plant out of 50 blooming, and then it takes a couple more years to see more and more and more, and so forth and so on. So some of these plants are really slow to flower, but some of them, like Baptisia, comes up just gangbusters the first year. You can't miss it. It's not hard to find it. But as I said, pollinator species. I'm working with a plant that Peter gave me, Peter Luce, many years ago. I want to say 1996 or 7. And I planted one Astavalus variety, winkleri. And then over time, I'm not sure what it was, whether it was a white or whatever, it creates seeds that have variable traits. And so very interesting stuff, because you'll have, this is your typical Gaillardia. Here's your maybe what is I would call typical winkleri. And then you see, light pink with a yellow center, and light pink with a little bit of rosy with a dark red center. And so you get all these variations. You get different shaped leaves, and fatter and skinnier, and really, really pretty landscape in a little tiny area. So notice there's a lot of grasses in that photograph. And I think without the grasses, you wouldn't see the winkleri. I don't think it would be there. It'll be 45 minutes? Okay. Getting close. And so other species that I'm using that are really wonderful to show up the first year or two is Coreopsis linifolia. I love this plant. In fact, Tony Avant at Plant Delights Nursery sells a selection that he found in the wild of Coreopsis linifolia. He sells it because it's a great plant. Very common aster, Praialtis, I believe, is one of the best monarch butterfly plants. Happens to bloom in October when they're making their way back. But you can go across the prairie and see all these wonderful plants, and there's a little lowly aster Praialtis, and all the butterflies are on it. They love that plant. So some of these images you've seen tonight, like these vistas of wildflowers in my field, if I turned around the other way, you wouldn't see that. So, everything changes as you turn around. And in fact, these trails that I have that separate my gardens that are actually fire lines, when you turn around, you go the other way, you see a totally different garden. And so highly variable, very exciting, long-lasting, and highly desirable. And you're preserving these landscapes by preserving the genetics, and then you're taking these genetics and you give them to your friends and you share them with other people, and they move down the line and so forth and so on. So different grasses are good. Good plants. And I want to wrap it up because I want to, and even in the wintertime, got a landscape that shows off when nothing's even alive up above ground. So I wanted to shut it down so that I can ask for questions. But one more thing. This is an experiment that I did this past year in April, a year ago. This was a power line right near me where they put gravel, crushed asphalt across the whole power line. They re-engineered it, put this gravel all the way across, and I went and clandestinely spread seed across the whole landscape. And look, growing in the asphalt. Now this is 6 inches deep. Is Rudbeckia grandiflora, little blue stem, and it's just full of plants. So the adaptability of these plants is tremendous. Excuse me? Okay. So I'll end at that, and maybe could ask for some questions. Anybody?
Well, maintenance.
Maintenance. So good question. Thank you. So I have friends up in the Midwest who are really, one of them is just a pioneer in landscaping with Prairie Landscapes. The name of the place is Prairie Nursery. Big business. And most of his work is done without fire. So very occasionally he has like a campus project or something that he's able to burn. Special situations where he's able to burn. But most of his places, I'd say 80 or 90%, he's not able to burn. So the question was, well, how do you do that? How do you create a landscape that needs fire, that when it doesn't get fire, doesn't just turn into a pile of whatever, just a jungle. The answer from these two people that I asked, and I've been working with that, the answer was you have to reduce the competition on the ground before you introduce the seed. And so if you're in the piney woods of Texas, it's very likely that you can turn around your landscape, number one, by just using fire. In other words, if you've got Bahia grass on the ground, and if you light that on fire for 10, 15 years, you're going to change that landscape. Things will come out of the ground that you've never seen before. So you can improve a landscape if you can burn it just by burning. But to go back to the not burning, the way that they do this is they do repeated herbicide applications. And so they're going in, like I do, with a boom on 4 acres or whatever, and they're just pulverizing the whole landscape in April. And then we come back again in May or June and do the same thing. And you, maybe even in between, you could till it. And then it just throws up all these seed that are dormant in the ground and needed that tilling to grow. And needed that spraying to release that seed that's been dormant. And so you spray and you till, and then you spray and spray and spray again, and then November you plant. In the case of a project Dr. Allen did in the Eunice area, it was flat land. We plowed and plowed and plowed and plowed. It came time to plant. It was too wet. We couldn't plant. And so we just said, well, we'll just plow again another year. And so the guy did, and we sowed the seed, and we got great projects. So my point is that you can, if you can eliminate a lot of the vegetation on the ground, you may be able, if it's a small garden, which I don't recommend. I recommend big landscapes, and I'll tell you why. But if it's a small garden, you can do like black plastic. But I think black plastic is even worse than let's say, herbicide. That's my opinion. What do you do with 50 by 50 of black plastic when you're done? I guess you do another area maybe. But so I'll get to the point of creating large landscapes as compared to small landscapes. So there's this terminology that is called the edge effect. And so if you have a tree line or if you have a mowed area, then that's the edge of a prairie, the tree line or the mowed area. And at the mowed area or the tree line, you'll get different species. In the sunny area where the mowed is and the prairie is, the prairie won't go into the mowed. The mowed area won't go into the prairie. It's almost just a defined line. And like I'm mowing like 3 times a year in my fields, the pathways. And almost no prairie plants grow in there, except little blue stem maybe. Everything else just doesn't like the mowing. If you have a large landscape and you have X amount of seed, let's say it's 10 pounds of seed, and you have an acre of land. And so then you have a 50 by 50 and you have 10 pounds of seed. It's better to have that acre of land. What happens is if you spread that seed out, you have more chances, number one, of that seed being able to grow and compete, and you're spreading that seed out. The edge effect, sometimes it may be 2 feet, it may be 12 feet, or it may be 20 feet or more. Just depends on the situation. And so if you have a 20-foot garden and you have the edge effect coming in 5 feet, then you only have a small part of the garden that can become matured, let's say, or established without the edge effect affecting it. Where these large landscapes, and you'll see if you try it. You do an acre of land, and you'll see that seed that you've used really fills in on the center, and on the edges you'll have that edge effect. But you'll have much more space in between that becomes established and so forth. So if that makes any sense, that's what I've learned. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a booklet or pamphlet or something that can help us identify our wildflowers that are growing in our prairies? I'm not going to remember those names. I need to know the names.
Well, yes, there are a number of books. Dr. Allen has, of course, books, and he has some tonight with him. But there are books, of course, for Texas. I think, though, that rather than, along with using books, what I think is best is if you can find a botanist who goes out and like field trips where people are going out into the prairie, where you can follow behind them, and then you can learn, number one, this prairie and that prairie, and then you learn a little plant or two along the line, and then you work with that plant, you'll learn it. So you won't learn it unless you work with it. At least that's my experience. So.
Plans to introduce prairie dogs, bison.
Say that one more time.
Any plans to introduce prairie dogs or bison?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't have the answer, but I'll tell you this. All I know is I just make the prairies, and everything else can come after. But yeah, that's a.
That's what makes a healthy prairie.
Well, that's a good point. So let me talk about that real quick. What really makes a healthy prairie is fire and grazing animals. So the combination of the two is what I understand creates the most biodiversity. So yes, to your point. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
What about the role of overseeding? When you're trying to get a prairie established, at what point would you discontinue that?
Okay, so he's talking about overseeding, so that maybe that you've already planted a prairie and you want to introduce more seed. So that's a good point. And a couple of my friends, as I mentioned, from the Midwest, one of them told me, and maybe the other one too, is that you get one time to plant, and you got to make it right the first time. However, there are some species that can be introduced that are just so eager to grow, like little blue stem, monarda. I mean, these plants, I think that, and in fact, I know for sure little blue stem is one that I've overseeded in my field 15 years later in an area where I didn't put grasses, and I had Bahia persist. I had Virginia blue stem come in, broom sedge blue stem, but I realized later that the most successful planting that I did was the one where I had that little handheld machine, and I was able to focus on some grasses along with the wildflowers. And what that told me was that it was essential to have the grasses to outcompete, like Bahia grass was what was most dominant in my field. And so I did introduce, well, I actually seeded it with a really wonderful mix of seed, almost nothing else other than the blue stem that I saw, that I noticed or could tell. I didn't do any scientific research. But so you really have to, if you're going to do it, you want to wait and plow and gather seeds, and you get that one chance to do it. And then if you didn't get it right, or you want to try something new, which I would highly recommend you try, instead of one project, try 4 projects in that one space. Different things in that one garden area. Make notes of what you've done, as I did, and then you can go back and say, well, this worked or that didn't work or whatever. But really, most of the time, at least in my experience, this works. And so anyway, yes, sir.
From that overseeding, would you plow it?
No, yeah.
Just put it on the stubble or whatever?
Yeah, once I just overseeded, didn't do anything. I'm sorry. What I did was, in one area I mowed, in one area I burned. And I don't know if I did another thing, but I tried 2 different experiments to see. It came up with, it's just blue stem everywhere. So, but I'm a big fan of blue stem. And for the reason that it carries a fire, and it creates a really hot fire. Yep.
You mentioned when to put the seed in, but you didn't mention about when to burn.
Good question. And so that is a debatable subject. And, for a number of years, everybody didn't burn because Smokey the Bear said so. And so then they realized, well, we got to burn. And then they, like the Forest Service, they typically burn, and most people typically burn in the wintertime. Maybe one of the reasons is because it's so hot in the summer that you maybe don't want to be burning. You're in, outfit and you're fighting fire. But Dr. Bill Platt, who is a biologist who I've talked with on some occasions, he said that it's almost inconsequential to burn in the winter as compared to the summer. On the other hand, Dr. Allen says he doesn't see any different in a winter burn and a summer burn. But the theory is that especially if you're burning not only for your herbaceous plants, but you're burning to kill your nemesis, the trees that are growing in your prairie, then the idea is that you let that tree just grow on out and put all its energy right up to, let's say, May, June, or if right as it's budding up to flower, and then you burn it. And then what I've been doing is trying to time my burns when it's dry. In other words, you can burn a landscape when it's somewhat moist. You couldn't burn it today because it's a little wet outside. But if you go a week and you burn the landscape, well, it burns. But if you burn it when it's really, really dry, then you get a burn that just goes down to the ground. And you have very little stubble, very little duff on the ground, and it just completely burns the ground to the dirt, as I showed you in one of the photographs. Did I answer the question? Okay, all right. Yes?
Mark, I guess I have a couple of questions. Using glyphosate, you do this repetitively, using a little Roundup?
Yes.
Is that only when you have Bermuda grass and Bahia, or that's just period?
Well, Bermuda grass for me and Bahia they're not a problem. Now, I've heard people who are prairie people or biologists say that, restoration people say that Bermuda grass is a really problematic plant. But I don't consider it to be a problematic plant. Johnson grass, on the other hand, is a problematic plant. There are a lot of problematic plants, King's Ranch.
So why use Roundup? Why not just plow it to death?
Well, then that's the only reason I would. Well, there's a number of reasons, but one is if you're trying to put a prairie on a slope, then you have erosion potential. However, you can leave some strips unplowed, horizontal to the slope, and so you can do that. When I planted my fields, they're on slopes, pretty good slopes, some of them, and I just plowed them up and put the seed out, and I hayed in some of the channeling areas, just to prevent a little. So I did one plowing. So I think if you did repetitive plowings, then you might be in a position where you put yourself in a bit of a jeopardy. But yeah, I really know the concern on the herbicide. I have become really focused on the herbicide because, because the client doesn't want a bunch of weedy plants in their landscape. They want it transitioned overnight, and it's not going to do that anyway. So what I'm trying to do, and especially in an urban situation, like in New Orleans, you got 300 years of introductions of everything in disturbance. And so it's not just the weedy species, it's the disturbance factor that really causes a lot of competition, which can be a lifetime of competition. And so what I learned from that one last planting, again, was that even if you don't do a lot of repetitive prep, if you're heavy on the grass seed, then the grass will work for you to suppress a lot of these species, and in at least in several cases that I've seen with very little prep, mine included, they transition well. But I think the fire is the key. When you're doing very little prep, you're putting seed out, you really need to be burning. And in fact, Dr. Platt says you really can't have these landscapes without burning. Yeah, but again, everybody, lots of people have different positions on all of these ideas. And in fact, I would say that there is a need for, let's say, East Texas and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, local genetic seed production. And I'm not talking about the kind of work that I do, although I think the work that I do is fantastic, and it really I think it's the only way to go. But there is a market, I think, and a niche for a young person who has some energy to produce little production fields that can eventually, separate all these different species so that you can have a much more marketable product. Like Dawn knows when she got my seed, it's just a bunch of fluff and stuff, and it's not very impressive. But I'm very proud to say, and I give the credit to Dr. Allen, Dr. Vadrine, that my good friend Larry Weiner, who is a landscape fellow, does what I do. But he gets his seed from Ernst Seed and the internet, and they put it in a drill, and they know how many seed per square foot went out, where that seed went. They just have it all scientifically figured out. But Larry calls my work the real deal, and that is, I'm going to get that seed from the highest quality area that I can get it from, and just transfer it to a new area. And so you're getting all these species that are supposed to be in that area from the good spot. So anyway, that's what it's worth. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that handheld harvester looked real interesting. So I'm curious. Say I want to collect bacteria. What's the safe buffer zone, especially if I ask my good friend to spot out where the thicker clumps are? How far away should I be with that harvester from the person that's spotting out the thicker seed clumps? Because I still have scars and welts.
Peter. Yeah, the handheld machine, I had to give it up because, you're going along and you trip over a briar, or you fall in a hole, and it's a pretty awkward machine, but it really did my work for me. It helped me do my work for a long time. Yes, sir.
So you were saying in preparation, you like to get it down to bare ground and plant in November. Well, that leaves 4, 5, 6 months of bare ground through wet season. Where are you doing from erosion?
Very unlikely. So, let me preface by saying that there are summer weeds and winter weeds, as you probably know. And so if you're, let's say you're disturbing the ground by either plowing or spraying, for that matter, then you're eliminating some of the vegetation that was there, and you're releasing this other vegetation. And then you go and you plant, you spray or you till or whatever, and then you plant, and immediately what happens is you've done that disturbance, you've caused a lot of native annual plants that were in the seed bank that you haven't been able to spray or whatever. You might have tilled them, but they were thrilled when you tilled. And I like that. So you immediately get a winter ground cover that's annual, that goes into the spring, finishes up about right now, and that's about the time your prairie. So when those annuals finish up, and I depend on those really to come up and to hold the ground in the wintertime. When they grow off and they get to about right now and go into June, and it gets so hot that they just completely collapse and die back. They seeded and they finished. They turn brown, and the whole time though, that ground generally hasn't been like covered solidly. It's covered with vegetation, but you can see the soil. And when that vegetation, those annuals all die back, then at that same time, that's when the prairie species start to germinate and grow. So right now is when the winter, the November seeding that you've done really starts to grow. And as I said, some species don't even start to the second year or third year, or maybe they'll grow in small amounts, and so small you can't recognize them, or they're covered up a little bit. But so the answer is that these annual species are what kind of holds your soil together and protects the soil from the rain and washing and so forth. I do and have used wheat or even rye in some cases. Like if it's just a slight possibility of erosion, I'll use wheat. If it's a heavy possibility of erosion, I'll use rye, because rye tends to be much more massed and covers the ground, where wheat is a good one to use because it doesn't cover the ground as much. It's more straight up and down, and so that sunlight penetrates. But basically, all those annuals go away, and then the perennials start in the summer, and then you're off and running. And then even in the summer, you're going to typically get some of the seed bank grow off from that ground, but then after a while, the prairie species mature and then proliferate to the point where they move any of those species out. Good example is Bahia grass. Bahia grass is not a problem at all. It's actually beneficial, again, because it carries a fire. So if it comes in after you've plowed and planted, that's no problem. An example about Bermuda grass is one that, a very small area. I had Bermuda grass, and I seeded this prairie, and then Bermuda grass just grew and grew and grew, because we weren't mowing or anything. But this one patch from here, let's say to the end of the wall, was just solid Bermuda grass. And by the end of the, it went through a whole summer, and then into the winter, and then I burned it in the spring, and it was this tall, and it was all brown, and it was a hot, hot fire because of that Bermuda grass. And it was almost like overnight the Bermuda grass was gone, and the blue stem and all the other prairie plants that were there just went, it was almost like a release. Now, I'm not sure if that'll happen every time, but I never look at Bermuda as a problematic species. And in fact, there's some species that'll come in, it's just like, well, they're there. And you just kind of let the garden develop as it will. Yes, ma'am?
Do you ever mow it?
You certainly can, and maybe should, if you're creating a 1-acre landscape or a 4-acre landscape in a home garden, let's say. If it's, you can if you want, and you don't have to if you don't. But what mowing will do will, let's say, if you, let's say if you're not burning, if you're not going to be able to burn, then you pretty much have to mow. Or, you know, it would be beneficial to mow, and you would do that in the spring. And so basically what you're doing is you're mowing as down to the ground as you can without scraping the ground with your machine. In other words, if it's, let's say it's a bush hog, you can't just put the deck on the ground. You have to keep it off of the ground so you don't open up the ground and you're creating a disturbance which causes weed seeds to germinate and so forth. But yes, if you mow the prairie, let's say in the spring, then you're removing all the previous year's growth, all of that winter brown dead stuff, and then you're starting from scratch, and then you get this real green growth without the interference of the dead vegetation from the previous year.
So you mean March or?
Yes, say, I would think February, March, January, February, March, even April, whatever. Yeah. Interesting thing that, you know, nothing is definite with the prairie. At least, you know, there are some things I'm sure, but there's always these questions, should I do this and should I do that? And I usually don't do anything and study it a while, and then study it again, and then maybe decide that you want to, let's say, mow or remove trees that are encroaching and that sort of thing. But it's a complicated matter, actually. It's Charles Allen's famous words are, just get the seed and put it out there and burn it and it'll grow. And it's true. But there are some things that you can do to enhance, or we talk about mowing. You know, if you get trees that come up and you burn, then you've still got a tree sapling that you know, is going to stand there until you know, maybe it falls over if it got burned enough. Maybe it didn't get burned enough and it'll leaf out and then it'll get bigger the next year. So then, you know, mowing is a beneficial element as far as that's concerned, yes. Anybody else? I think I'm gone way over time here. Gone. Thank you very much for your time.